Okay, so am I ready to go? Well, welcome to this event, very important one about political interference and academic freedom in Florida, which is prompted by this report by the AAUP on this that came out, I think it was in December, and we have one of the co-chairs of the committee, the AAUP committee, special committee that took a look at this and did a very detailed examination of what's going on there. And our featured speaker is Henry Reichman, who goes by Hank. I do want to note that this is an event sponsored or organized by the Center for Studies in Higher Ed here at Berkeley. We also have co-sponsorship by the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and as well as the Institute for International Studies. I have to give a shout out. My name is John Douglas. I'm a researcher here at Berkeley at the center, and which is part of the Goldman School of Public Policy. And so I'm just going to say a couple of preliminary remarks about Hank, and some observations, and then he's going to talk for about 10 minutes or so about the report, and then we'll have a discussion, and we'll be looking for some of your questions as they come in as well. I don't think we'll have a problem filling up the hour at all, and we will end promptly, I hope, at that time. So I want to note that Hank is a professor emeritus of history at Cal State East Bay, and is the author more recently of Understanding Academic Freedom, which is Johns Hopkins University Press in 2021. He has been the chair of what they call Committee A, which is the Academic Freedom Committee for the AAUP from 2012 to 2021, and is obviously still active with the AAUP. He has a BA from Columbia, but very importantly, a PhD from Berkeley in Russian and European studies, history, excuse me. One of his earlier books was Railway and Revolution, Russia, 1905. So pre-revolution Russia. So which is also by UC Press, which is great to know. And he's been the history department chair a number of years. So we're very lucky to have Hank join us and talk about this report, which is available. Also, there should be a link that we've had in our announcements if you want to take a look at it more in detail. I just want to say a couple of just general things before Hank goes into his talk and discussion. And that is that, we have these kind of mega trends going on here. And I just want to mention some of them beyond what is happening specifically in Florida. And one is, we have really dramatic enrollment trends going on in the United States, where most states are seeing a decline in enrollment for population reasons, but other kinds of factors that are going on in the post-COVID world. And we're seeing mergers and sometimes closures of off liberal arts colleges, these kinds of things. We have tuition increases in a sense that, it's out of control. And I want to note, though, earlier studies have shown around 85% of the increases in tuition in the public sector are directly related to declines in state investment in higher ed on a per student basis. But nevertheless, tuition is a big deal. And that leads us to the next one, which is student debt, which is also one that needs to delineate, I think, often where that debt is. It's highly concentrated in the for-profit sector and graduate education in areas like medical school and law and things like that. Not to downplay the $1.6 trillion in debt, but there's a lot of nuance in that story. And with this, we see this kind of erosion. These are only some of the aspects of an erosion of faith in higher ed, whether it's a path for jobs, this view of higher ed as a utilitarian good, or, this kind of sense that universities are intolerant and dogmatic environments, which is coming mostly from the right, but it's an important question. This is all leading to a real sense that maybe there's something really wrong with higher ed. And at least one semblance that we see in Florida is, a sense that something has to be done, and it must be done by right-wing politicians, perhaps. And we see a pattern there. So I just want to note some of those things. one final one, because this is something that Hank has written about, and also we see in the some pieces of this storyline in the report by the AAUP, is that we've had a long tradition, not beginning, but articulated really in 1957 by a Supreme Court Judge Felix Frankfurter, of the four freedoms for universities. This all came out of the fighting and biting related to the Red Scare and fears about communism and socialists in higher ed. And those are, determining who may teach, what can be taught, how it is taught, and who will be admitted. And this has had a strong tradition. You go through the Bakke decision and these kinds of things, you see the semblance of concerns about, obviously, civil liberties and individual rights, but this deference to the academy to operate and self-regulate internally that has brought us, one could argue, the greatest higher ed system in the world in terms of the quality of the institutions we have and the breadth of types of institutions with many flaws. So I just wanted to say a couple of those things, get my little two pence in. So with that, let's go to Hank.
Oh, thank you, John, for that very kind introduction. And you do get right to the heart of the matter about this question of the independence of higher ed. I mean, when the AAUP was first founded in 1915, in its founding document, the Declaration of Principles on Academic Freedom and Academic Tenure, they described universities, both private and public, as a public trust in which the faculty were the appointees of the trustees, and of course, in public institutions, the trustees are the appointees of the state. That they're the appointees, but not in any meaningful sense the employees, at least as regards to academic issues. So, in this light, let me talk a little bit about the background of the Florida report. It was a little more than a year ago when the AAUP decided that it needed a special investigation, and they appointed an 8-member committee. I think it was 8 of us, and asked me and my colleague Afshan Jaffer from Connecticut College to co-chair the investigation. Both of us had served in previous special investigations. And what we did was, over a number of months, we interviewed more than 65 faculty members. We actually tried to interview leading administrators in the system, but they all declined to speak with us. The people at the top claimed that we were biased. The people below them, I think, were just frightened, to be honest with you, even though we guaranteed anonymity if need be. And in May, we issued a preliminary report. And then finally, in early December of this year, we released our final report. And it had basically 5 main subsections within it. One, we devoted a major section to the extraordinary experience of New College in Florida, which is a small experimental college within the public university system that was literally taken over by Governor DeSantis when he appointed 6, and I think it's fair to say right-wing ideologues to the board of trustees, who immediately dismissed the president and began to reshape the school in the image, they said, of a very private Christian school, Hillsdale College, well known in right-wing conservative quarters. So we spent a bunch of time discussing New College, which it was just announced today. The AAUP has placed on its list of institutions sanctioned for violations of principles of governance. And that brings me to the second section of the report, which is on violations of governance standards around the appointment of university presidents, which are now in Florida, all done in secret, and increasingly are given to political cronies. There were other things we highlighted in there. Also, the attempt of the DeSantis administration ongoing to challenge the federal system of accreditation. And then we have a section on academic freedom, which we dealt with in particular a series of laws governing curriculum. And this goes to what you were talking about, John, that question of the right to decide what is taught, who teaches it, and how it is taught. And clearly, through a series of acts, the so-called Diversity Act, I can't remember the names of some of these, the Diversity Act, which guaranteed that students could not be shielded from ideas that made them uncomfortable. And of course, what at the time they thought were the ideas that would make them uncomfortable would be ideas that claimed racial superiority, frankly, for white people, or challenged notions of contemporary notions of gender identity, etc. But then yet a year later, they banned teaching that didn't, that would make people uncomfortable because it supposedly challenged white people and made them feel guilty, etc. That's the so-called Stop Woke Act, which is currently, its higher ed provisions at least, have been enjoined by U.S. District Court Judge Mark Walker, and that injunction is currently being appealed by the state. And then we had a section on bias and discrimination, because there are a whole series of laws aimed at disempowering initiatives for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also a whole bunch of actions which, taken as a whole, create we believe, a very negative impact for, in particular, for LGBTQ students, and especially trans students and faculty. And then finally, we had a section on what we called the human toll, because in fact, what we discovered is that faculty members throughout Florida really feel themselves under siege. So that's a basic outline of the report. It's fairly long. I printed out a copy this morning. You can see what it looks like, although it looks like it's a mirror image, I guess. But at any rate, I want to make 3 comments about the report before I open it up to your questions and then any questions from the audience. The first is to point out something that I find rather important. This was the 3rd special investigation in which I participated, the honor really of participating in just the last 3 years. We did a special investigation of violations of shared governance standard at 8 different institutions during the COVID pandemic. We did a special investigation of the higher education system in North Carolina. A central focus of that, of course, was the controversy over the appointment of Nicole Hannah-Jones, and also the controversy over the so-called Silent Sam statue. And then finally, there's this Florida investigation. Now, in its entire history of well over a century, the AAUP has only done, I think, 6 or 8 special investigations of this sort with multiple institutions, yet we've only now done 3 in just 2.5 to 3 years. And I think that says 2 things. One, it says something about how the AAUP is trying to adjust to what I am now beginning to call the current crisis of academic freedom, which is sweeping higher education, but also responding to the fact that it is no longer adequate and to look at academic freedom controversies campus by campus around each individual incident. 2 other points I wanted to make about the report. One is, one of the most important things I think we found, and it's one of the most discouraging things, is evidenced by what I said before about the fact that administrators would not, by and large, speak to us. The only ones who did were former administrators. And that is well, at best, it's either complicity or cowardice or both of so many administrators, from the deans on up to campus presidents, in confronting this kind of highly inappropriate and dangerous external state intervention into areas of higher education that must be and need to be free of such political meddling. And the third point I want to make is that as the audience to this event, I think, suggests, this is not just a Florida issue. To be sure, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, more, Florida became center stage in the fight over academic freedom and shared governance in higher education because, in part, Governor DeSantis made it a centerpiece of his ultimately disastrous attempt to run for the presidency. But Florida is not alone. And legislation and other activities similar to what we've seen in Florida, some of it word for word identical to what we've seen in Florida, is happening in state after state after state across the country, mainly in so-called red states where Republicans have control of all three branches of state government, but not entirely limited to those places. And I'll close my comments with that, and we can begin our discussion.
Well, related to this, seeing this commonality or certain patterns that are running largely through red states, but there's some nuance there. The Heritage Foundation and other groups have kind of created these blueprints. What's your sense of like how much does Florida reflect a national blueprint kind of, or is it out just DeSantis and the dynamics of Florida are very different or somewhat different? What's the role of these kind of larger groups in setting agendas? And one other thing I'll note is that Christopher Rufo is obviously probably at least known among some people. He was his interjection in the Harvard case is this thematic person who gets around. He was on the board of the, as you pointed out in your report, of the new college and this revamping of the board and the presidency. But sorry, back to that question. Do you see this kind of pattern of shared legislation, shared initiatives?
Well, yes, I do. And for example, I believe that one of the main pieces of legislation in Florida, the so-called Stop Woke Act, although they retitled it eventually and called it the Individual Freedom Act, because I think they realized that the Stop Woke Act would give it the political resonance that would precisely lead to the kind of decision we have so far from the U.S. District Court that it's a violation of academic freedom, not just in the sense that we in the AAUP use it, but in the legal sense that Justice Frankfurter and Justice Warren and others defined it back in the 1950s. And that act in particular was modeled, might have word for word from some of the executive orders of the late period of the Trump presidency that the President Biden, within literally days of coming into office, revoked. And these are national patterns that you see the same language and legislation everywhere. What has made Florida, I think, distinct are two things. One is when DeSantis won re-election against a apparently very weak opponent, he did so by a very large margin, and given the gerrymandering of the state, the Republicans were able to win supermajorities in both houses of the state legislature, although their vote is not really as big as the majority they hold. And that gave him the sense that he really had a free rein to go whole hog on this, but also it gave him the sense that, hey, I can run for president. And he decided to make this sort of the centerpiece of his presidential campaign. So I think that gave it a particular Florida twist, shall we say. But I think and we really tried to emphasize this in the conclusion of our report, that this is not simply a matter of a rogue state. This is part of a national drive and a national campaign to really undermine principles of higher education, of institutional autonomy, of academic freedom, of shared governance that really, as you pointed out, made American higher education the envy of the world. And frankly, we also point out, and this is something that you've eloquently written about yourself in your terrific book, Neo-Nationalism, that this is not just an American phenomenon either. I mean, there's a lot linking not only Ron DeSantis and Christopher Rufo with people in other states, but Ron DeSantis and Christopher Rufo with Viktor Orban, or for that matter, Vladimir Putin or Narendra Modi. So,
Well, reflecting these kind of patterns that we see in illiberal democracies and autocracies is that there's a pattern generally and a playbook, one could say. But it tends to start with making sure that you're replacing boards or or shifting the governance structure and presidents and these kinds of things. And this seems to be at least part of this. It's just amazing to look at how many bills have been passed in Florida alone related to various aspects of what we would think, I think, more traditionally is interventions into what are supposed to be semi or autonomous institutions. But getting back to this, this process of reconstituting boards, such as a new college, but also the University of Florida and the system. These are really the beginnings of a way to then come down and potentially have an impact on the activities of faculty. I mean, they aren't necessarily in sequence, but there's a structure related to that. And that's one thing, I wanted to ask you, because you have looked at the legal foundations of academic freedom and autonomy, is, this is being redefined legally in some form, but it's also informally. There are various structures going on. What are the patterns we see in Florida, that you've gotten out of your observations?
well, let me make 2 points about it. One is I think we'd be naive if we were not to acknowledge that throughout the history of American higher education, that boards of trustees, both in public and in the private sector, have been political. And when they're in public higher education, when there's a Democratic governor, they tend to appoint Democrats. When there's a Republican governor, they tend to appoint Republicans. And insofar as Democrats and Republicans have different ideas about higher education, that's going to impact things. But what has been new, in particular in Florida, and not only in Florida, has been that one, it's not just that DeSantis has appointed Republicans. He's appointed Republicans who see themselves first and foremost as ideologues and with an agenda to transform higher education, as opposed to Republicans who see themselves, whatever their views on higher education, as rather responsible for the stewardship of higher education, which is a little bit different in the way trustees work. And the result has been we get people on boards now who are they're politicians first and foremost. They're not people who've shown interest in the past in supporting institutions. A lot of times governors will appoint people who've been active in alumni associations and things like that. But they're political activists. Some of them are actually lobbyists, and they've now appointed as college presidents people who have no experience in higher education or very limited experience.
Ben Sass is an example, although he did have some higher ed.
Not even the worst. I mean, Ben Sass at least has some sense of experience. He has a higher degree, and indeed, they did do a legitimate, not the process that I would have liked. It was not a completely open search the way I think they should be. But people at the campus said to us, we can't terribly complain. There were faculty on the committee. We thought he was not a terrible appointment. The most outrageous one is at Florida Atlantic, where one of the worst of the Florida legislators, a guy named, I can't remember his first name, Fine is his last name, basically announced while the search was going on that he was going to be the next president because Governor DeSantis promised it. And then when the search didn't hire him, he complained. And as we've now found out through FOIA requests, the next thing you know is they canceled the search. And then they found some supposed violations of the process, which were really, insofar as they were genuine, they weren't important, but they were also clearly ex post facto justification. So that's the kind of thing that I think we're seeing in these boards. So
yeah, so another kind of question I had lined up for you was to ask you about, well, where are the courts, or where's the legal side of this equation? There's some areas in which, um, you know, legal action could help thwart these agendas. And specifically, you note in the report, there's this Online Freedom and Viewpoint Diversity Act, which you referred to before, which has very much the ring of a Chinese cybersecurity state, in that it allows students to record uh, uh, faculty. The concept is the classroom is kind of a sanctuary that is controlled by the faculty as a professional, and that they can record and report these people, and creating these kinds of agents of that can report on whether the faculty are politically correct in a conservative way. And another one is the Stop Woke Act. And at least on the first one, it was interesting that I didn't realize was the court action basically said, well, we don't think this is such a great law, but we don't see any enforcement mechanism. Therefore, we let it stand, which is kind of a strange way of looking at things, I think. And then the other one on the Stop Woke Act, there's this injunction on it, in at least some sense, by who's the judge? Oh yeah, Mark Walker. That it's I think he quoted in one of his statements, positively dystopian in terms of trying to control what is done in the classroom. Yeah. So back to this question: is there legal recourse that we can find, or is it basically that's not going to really save the day?
Well, yes and no, in a sense. First of all, let me say something about these laws. One of the things that's interesting of those two laws you talked about is they're mutually contradictory. A faculty member cannot essentially comply with the provisions of the first law, the Viewpoint Diversity Act, and not violate the second law, the Stop Woke Act, or vice versa. And as one of our interviewees pointed out to us, he said, that's a feature, not a bug. Because in fact, and this also goes to the lack of enforcement mechanisms, which is, in fact, the goal here is less to get individual faculty members charged with a violation of the law or anything like that. It's to create an atmosphere in which faculty members feel they don't know what they're allowed to do and what they aren't. And that's the whole thing. And we see it in statements that faculty members make. A second point to make about this is very interesting, is in appealing Judge Walker's ruling, the state of Florida has made a very bold argument, which is that faculty members are government employees. And when they speak, and this is following along in the tradition of the Garcetti decision, when they speak as government employees, which they are doing when they're teaching their classes, because that's what the government has hired them to do, they speak for the government, and therefore the government can tell them what they can and can't say. And this is the most chilling thing, of course, and this is exactly why Justice Souter, back in the Garcetti case, asked, he said, wait a second, what are we doing here? Would this apply to college and university professors? And the court punted on it by saying, we don't have to decide that now. But clearly the state of Florida is saying, well, let's decide it. And let's decide it that basically faculty members are the mouthpieces of the state. And this is particularly chilling. Now, I'm hoping, of course, that this will not go anywhere, because I don't see how we could have a public higher education system. We haven't had that.
Yeah, no, that's really scary. I guess this question that comes back to, which I referred to before, is, well, what's the enforcement mechanism? What are they doing in order to, actually monitor or have an actual repercussions on faculty or students or whatever? And one of the things you talk about in the report is this post-tenure review process, which, I think most universities now have that, or, research universities for sure, and most universities, I guess. Berkeley's actually had a version of post-tenure review, where UC in general since the 1920s. I've actually done a little bit of research on this, so but it's integrated, but it's part of its internal process of quality assurance and monitoring this kind of thing. So it's very different. But the post tenure, in other words, making a law that then has the enforcement of a uniform process of post tenure, and then I guess possible using that as a mechanism to enforce these stop woke and other kinds of acts. So anyway, to comment a little bit more about what is the mechanisms for actually, taking actions against a faculty member.
Well, let me first, the general mechanisms, it's unclear. And in fact, the campuses are in the state university system have been engaged in all sorts of things of trying to tell faculty members what they can, what they can't do. And of course, they're having a big deal of trouble with it because there's no case law, there's nothing specific, etc. But with respect to the post-tenure review, I think that is one of the scariest things that has come out of Florida. And of course, not only Florida, we've seen these kinds of post-tenure review laws in Georgia and in other states. But every one of the campuses in the Florida State University system, as you pointed out, already had a post-tenure review policy. And it was, in most cases, it was, as I'm sure it is at Berkeley, as it is at most universities, aiming to be constructive, developmental, to try to help faculty keep up with their fields, keep up with the latest pedagogy, et cetera, make sure, but not punitive. It was never connected with you could lose your tenure, you could be disciplined. It was not a disciplinary process. Now, what Florida has done is, even though they already had a process at every single campus, they now standardized it in a way, and this is the State Board of Governors policy implementing the law, that you mandate a review, and that in that review, the provost and the president have the right to essentially decide, even if the review comes up from below, goes through things and all, says, Professor X is doing great. Maybe he could, publish a little bit more in this field, or whatever the recommendations is, but we recommend, and the provost or president have the right to unilaterally say, no, we think he should be fired. In other words, if that is the policy, and we don't know if any provost or president will want to act on that. One would hope not, but you don't know, given what we were talking about before about the kind of people being appointed as presidents. Then you have no tenure at all. It's not post-tenure review. It's a reappointment review.
Yeah. Also, it's I think a 4-point scale. The way that they portrayed that there could be, you're doing great, something, and then the last scale is a grounds for firing.
Yeah, but the most important thing is that whatever the people who actually work with the colleague decide the ranking should be, can be just simply arbitrarily changed at the top.
Yeah, no, it's yeah. Again, we're getting back at least to the theme that what we've thought of as norms of autonomy and institutional self-regulation and these kinds of things have been so important for the development of higher education and the quality of it in the United States that it hasn't been severely restricted by edicts by a ministry, for example. We don't have a ministry, and there's limited power that the Department of Ed has compared to most nation states. So in any case, this autonomy is so important. So another aspect that does relate to the federal government, though, going through this list, this is like an amazing list of areas in which there's intervention that's just it's even hard to imagine, but is accreditation. And there's this legal case, and I know that so sorry to give proper reference to the audience, is that the state of Florida is questioning the regional and self-accreditation process in the United States, which has always been independent. It goes way back. I think before the 30s, but really became important with the GI Bill in the 1950s as a way to, for the federal government to ascertain whether institutions are quality enough to invest student aid, the GI Bill being the beginning, and then otherwise. But back to accreditation, is the state of California, state of Florida is questioning that process and using legal basis to say, no, it should be states should be able to do this. And this has now also been integrated into the Trump presidential campaign agenda for higher ed, is to end the accreditation process as we know it. So long introduction, but like, what is going on here? What's the leverage that DeSantis and his group will get out of making accreditation a state function?
Well, I think that this goes back to what their argument has been in that appeal, is that the universities belong to the state universities, and when the the universities therefore should be subordinate to the state, and the state should be able to tell them what to do, what to say. I mean, the same way if they can tell. Now, on one level, of course, the state can decide, do we need another law school? Maybe not. Do we want to have a nursing school? Do we want to have our most of our schools teach liberal arts, or do we want them mostly to be polytechnics or whatever? Those are legitimate state decisions, and accreditors have always acknowledged that. But what the DeSantis administration wants to be able to say is that basically Florida, the state of Florida and the state of Florida alone can determine everything about its higher education system, and including down to what faculty members teach in class. And that would be nightmare enough if Florida was evenly balanced between political parties and there was diversity in the boards, etc. It would still be an atrocious way to run an university system. But in the context of Florida today, where we have, at least for the time being, for better, for worse, I think, but we have, for all intents and purposes, virtually one-party government in Florida, the implications are doubly horrific.
No, I think this is a sleeper that a lot of people don't quite realize how significant that would be. I think if I remember correctly, the accreditation process in the United States, which is unique, like in most, in other parts of the world, ministries have some accreditation process and control. Here, it's been a tradition of independence, and again, arguably has led to good quality institutions in the U.S. But there's a provision, I think, in the Higher Ed Act, which has been perpetually up for reauthorization since 2008. That again, it goes way back. That's been in there that says that's the accreditation process. So we got two fronts. One, the Trump administration is trying to say, the Trump campaign, if they become
let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Well, there's lots of scary stuff out there, and so could just try to figure out a way to end that. I mean, there's this Republican bill right now in the House, probably not going to go anywhere, that would do that. Then there's the legal side and what the Florida's doing. So it's just a really we have everybody has complaints about the accreditation process in the United States, and there are a lot of problems, yes. But this would be really a significant shift in power to have the states do that. So I just wanted to add that. So along the list, going on the list of things in this report, is the Hamilton Institute, right? The Hamilton Institute, yeah. The Hamilton Center at the University of Florida, which is also a very interesting case study. And we're seeing these kinds of things. But why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I love this Hamilton Center proposal. The first thing that's really funny about it is one assumes that it's supposedly named for Alexander Hamilton, but it isn't. there's no, it's just Hamilton. Just, that's all. And anyway, it's a proposal came from some private lobbyist who was acting on behalf of an organization that nobody could figure out who they actually were, but there was clearly money behind them. And they got the legislature to give a budget line to establish this center at the University of Florida, which would, for all intents and purposes, if it was to be, if it worked the way they wanted it to work, would be basically an alternate school of social sciences. The proposal was that it would hire faculty, but existing faculty would have no say in those hirings. Who would is unclear. Apparently administrators, maybe donors, what have you. And so far, it hasn't fully come to fruition. But everybody we talked to at the University of Florida looks at the thing and says, what is this thing? What is this center? And of course, what it's reminiscent of are these kind of centers that the Charles Koch Foundation and its allied groups, like the Martin Center in North Carolina and elsewhere, were famous for establishing their own intellectual centers with a particular ideology, etc. And of course, outside funded centers, including, by the way, on the left or liberal centers, often have the problem that they're really ideologically motivated. They have a particular thing, and we all have to be very careful of them. And they always have to be governed by the same things that govern normal, shall we say, academic units and departments in universities. What is interesting about this, however, is that it's no longer coming from private money, which was problematic enough. It's now the state acting as if it were a private donor funding a particular program with a particular political and ideological coloration to it, as opposed to funding the institution with an understanding that higher ed is higher ed, and it's not left-wing higher ed or right-wing higher ed, it's higher ed with all its diversity and messiness and nuance, etc.
Well, I think, I think, again, getting back to the autonomy theme, is that having lawmakers decide that there should be a center at a major university. The University of Florida is a top-notch research university, member of the AAUP. I'm sorry, of the AAU. And to then create an entity externally with no visible support by faculty, for one, we could go to a broader academic community as well. And then creating this entity, or at least the concept is, with its own at least initial funding stream. Who knows, does it have an endowment? I didn't quite get all of that, like the Hoover Institute. But and then internally having a say without, I guess, reference to the larger university academic community as to who is on the faculty, because it's faculty, they call them faculty positions, not just researchers. Right. So it's really, I think a very alarming conceptual model, and just totally abrogates the role of the academic community at the institution as to what its rights and what it's controlling and quality control. So I just thought that was extremely, very, very upsetting. And I'm sure there probably are some other examples going on. I made this one little, in my little set of questions I sent you in advance, was there kind of rings a little bit like the Confucius Institutes, in that they're these kind of strange entities that were brought in with external funding that are now, with some excitement originally, when there still was a sense that every connection with China was worthwhile. But the Confucius Institutes also have this strange, and now they're being, largely eliminated over time, autonomy from the institutions themselves and practicing their own kind of versions of free speech. All right, so now I want to
Can
transition
I just say
to
something about
yeah,
that, though?
yeah.
Because I'm glad you made that comparison, because although the Confucius Institutes are now, I think there's only 6 of them left. But one of the things that the federal government made it that you couldn't have a Confucius Institute at any campus where you got DoD language funding, which is what, you know, they taught Chinese language, a lot of them. And but there was a provision in the law that there could be a waiver of that. And I ended up being a consultant on a report that was done for the National Academies of Sciences on what the standards should be for a waiver. And the great thing about that is it's kind of not a very useful thing, because I don't think anybody's going to have any Confucius Institutes for a while. But the standards they had for a waiver were the standards that I think should be applied to any outside funded center of that sort. And it was that the faculty there are under the same regulations as faculty everywhere, that there's shared governance, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They went into considerable detail on it, but it was really remarkable. And of course, that's not what's happening. And the one other thing to say about this is it's interesting. What I mentioned before that I had worked on the North Carolina report. And there in North Carolina, the trustees closed down 2 centers, so had broad faculty support, because they determined that they didn't like their sort of left liberal leanings. But what they really didn't like is the guys, the directors of those centers at the time were public critics of the Republican legislature. Gene Nickel, for example, at the law school, was the head of one of the centers, and he published stuff in the newspapers, and they closed down his center. So you're getting it from both directions. They closed down the centers where they don't like people, and they established centers with their own people.
Well, you know, Republicans like DeSantis and some other states, you know, are really leveraging, at least to some degree, frustration with higher ed and perception about it costing too much. Again, maybe not utilitarian enough, these kinds of things. But, you know, I think we could say there are some aspects of the internal life of American universities and otherwise that, you know, have some faults and have maybe created an image that is, at least for some of the population, worrisome or non-supportive. So I'm kind of asking this question is, well, you know, is there some fault within the university community? Now there's such a diversity of institutions, but is there some fault within the academy in the United States about the perception that's fed into these you know, extreme efforts at intervention that show a kind of at least a frustration, I think, with American higher ed?
Well, I think there are a number of things, and certainly those of us in higher ed, you know, unless we've got our head in the sand, know very well the flaws of our institutions and our faults. But I would say, to my mind, the biggest problem is not, as some people would have it, the, you know, political correctness gone wild, or the woke virus, or whatever kind of nonsense they want to talk about it. But it's been what some people call the corporatization. I prefer the term academic capitalism that some other scholars have used, that has taken over much of higher education over the last 30 or 40 years, the sense that universities have to be run like a business. Well, if you run them like a business, one of the first principles of business is the customer is always right. And how many faculty members have been told by administrators, et cetera, well, the students, they're your customers. They're not. Because if they were my customers, I'd have to satisfy them, and I'd give them all A's. You know, it's like, and I think what we're seeing is universities that kowtow to the dollar, and this is what bothered me so much in Florida, is this feeling that the administrators up and down the line, and let me give you an example. I hate to name names, but I will. Laura Rosenberry who is currently the president of Barnard College at Columbia University. And of course, you may have heard that at Barnard, they recently just unilaterally, she just implemented a law that basically said that faculty and students couldn't make any political statements on bulletin boards, on websites, etc., and defining politics very broadly. Well, before she came to Barnard, Laura Rosenberry was the dean of the law school at the University of Florida. And when we talked to Florida law school faculty members, to a person, they all were shocked that she had failed upward, as they would put it, to Barnard, because she completely accommodated to every wish of the DeSantis administration. She was the dean when they told faculty members at the law school that they couldn't testify in court if they were testifying against the state. That's what we're seeing is a certain kind of careerism, a certain business orientation in so many of our administrators that seeps through the entire institution, including, I will acknowledge, to portions of the faculty, that I think has made us vulnerable because we lose sight of what the heck is the whole purpose of higher education to begin with.
Well, one thing I've felt about the DEI fight is that for various reasons, there's been this morphing from equal opportunity to affirmative action to the terminology to DEI. And it's lumping in a huge number of kinds of activities, everything from, a lot of it's like student support services for, Latino kids from community colleges going to a major university. So it's just a great variety. It gets all lumped into one kind of, thing. And then there are, I think, and we've had a series of papers, and you contributed commentary on the use of DEI statements as a screen at UC, and that's changed. Anyway, there's an array of things going on. I think sometimes it'd be worth decoupling them or redefining their names. And I know Texas is doing this in some form because of this, external pressure of a law. That's a sad thing too. Is in other words, there's a kind of, what is it that we're doing internally that we can improve and perhaps, redefine the discussion. But that's a tough nut to crack. But I'm going to ask you that, and that is, what is it that we can do within the academy? There's some references in the report, but what are some of the things we could be doing in order to improve our public perception? But another question would be our ability to influence lawmakers, but the public side. And again, this red-blue state is really, and purple, is a really complex problem because the perceptions are very different among Republicans. At least the polls tell us that. So back to this question, what is it that we can do?
Well, one of the problems I think we face is academics, no matter what their field, be it humanities and social sciences, in hard sciences, business faculty too, we're used to nuance. We're used to like complexity. And as you're right, I mean, these issues can be very highly complex, and our enemies don't look at it that way. I mean, DEI has now become this code word for God only knows what. In the same way we saw it earlier with critical race theory, and Christopher Rufo is a master at reducing some very complicated things in which there can be reasonable disagreements and debates and attempts at experiments and trial and error to try to solve problems into some kind of boogeyman. So critical race theory, which is, a very sophisticated, complicated area of legal study, is now reduced to some, reverse racism. That's all it is, and I think it is a real challenge for us to address that. And I think one of the things we have to do is, and I think this is true if administrators aren't going to do it, then we faculty have to do it. We have to be more outwardly oriented and explain better. I don't know, it's a tough nut to crack, but explain better what it is that we really do. What is it? I mean, I love this thing that, faculty are indoctrinating students in class. And I know so many of my colleagues will sit there and go, if only. You know, my resources is indoctrinate them. I can barely get them to read the syllabus. You know, it's like, why? Because that's not what we're about. That's not what we do in class, and we all know that. Even the most ideological of us, even the ones among us who some of us, maybe you, maybe me, might sit there and go, "Whoa, come on, you know, that's a little too far for me." Very, very few faculty members fit the stereotype that, you know, some, of course, will, is hundreds of thousands of faculty members in the country, you know. So, but I think we have to do a much better job of getting out there and saying, this is what we really do. This is how we teach. This is what teaching is like, you know. And will people listen? I don't know. I hope so. But I mean, on the other hand, I think there is a big reservoir of goodwill toward higher education. And even the people most critical, it's telling to me that all these politicians who sit there and go after elite universities have degrees from elite universities. And I'll bet you any amount of money have sent or are planning to send their children and their grandchildren to elite universities if they can.
Well, I think that, you know, at least points one is how important the AAUP is at this moment. You know, I think we can see these kinds of periods of time when perhaps not as powerful or meaningful, but it is right now. I mean, I think if you pick up almost any article in the New York Times or elsewhere, there's somebody who's a member of the AAUP providing some kind of sense of what's going on. But I think one thing too you're pointing to is that, well, you know, is this a granular kind of issue? In other words, I think most people support their local institutions. You know, it's kind of like they like their local congressman, but they don't like the concept of the beast, the mega deep state of some sort. I'm exaggerating all these things, but you know, how much is it these institutions can really work locally? And you know, there's been some work that has been done that's kind of showing, you know, like let's start using the research on communications and how to persuade people, and start integrating it a little bit more into how local universities operate and work with their local constituents or stakeholders in some form. So you know, but we're about to wrap up, and I just one last question that relates to the future and concern about a potential Trump administration. Are there kinds of issues you want to, you know, mention or that are being thought about in the AAUP as we go into the election cycle if a Trump president returns?
Well, I think if we get a Trump administration, I think it'll be more of a disaster for the country as a whole than just higher education. I mean, I think that clearly the attack on higher education, as important as it is, and within that attack, the attack on academic freedom, which is, I think, the most important part of the attack on higher education, because it's so central to what we do. It's important all that is, it's still only one front in a bigger assault on, essentially, on representative democracy, on liberal democracy, shall we say, in the United States and internationally. And I think people need to put it in that context. And that's, I know, I mean, I'm no longer hold a official position in the AAUP, although I contribute whenever they ask me to, and sometimes even when they don't ask me to. But I don't know exactly what in particular is being talked about, but I know most of my colleagues, I think, are increasingly seeing this in whatever differences we may have among ourselves as academics about some questions, like, for example, DEI, where I think there are genuine, important, and interesting debates to be had about how best to approach higher education in a much more diverse society than we had even 20 years ago, much less 50. That we really all need to join together and fight for the kind of democracy that we need in order to have a great public higher education system.
Well, just
And
as
a private one that serves the public good too.
one side note in this, we haven't talked on this side so much, but what's the future of the scientific community and its strength and health in the United States if a Trump administration comes up? He had a strong agenda to cut huge amounts from basic research. It all failed because everybody said that's unreasonable in Congress at that time. But there's an agenda there about controlling what kind of research is being done, whether it's climate change or pollution or other things. But so that's a specter that's really sitting out there as well if a Trump administration comes about. On the autonomy theme, again, no administrator would voluntarily talk with you in that large grouping is it almost feels like conspiratorial. I mean, was there some messaging going on, or did they just individually make that assessment? Whatever the answer is, I'm going to now end with a quote that's in the report by Paul Ortiz, a professor of history at the University of Florida, who is one of your interviewers. And he said, a repressive state depends not just on passivity, but also isolation. Through a sense of disconnection with others, it encourages a deeper alignment with the state. And again, that's a theme that we see in other illiberal democracies and autocracies. And we all worry about this cliff of some sort. I hope it's not, maybe we're exaggerating. Let's hope we're exaggerating, but it's really quite worrisome. So with that, Hank, I want to thank you so much for taking the time and talking about this report. Again, we had a link to the report in the announcement, so I encourage you, those who are there or listening after this event, to take a look at it. It's really detailed and interesting, and and good footnotes too, good references. So again, thank you very much, Hank.